talk on our talk today is on financial literacy. We're going to have the opportunity to ask advisors some financial questions. The talk is recorded today just for the first session, where we're going over some previously submitted questions. When we get to the opportunity to open up the chat for everyone to ask questions, we will stop the recording at that point. So likely the first half an hour or so of this meeting. We're excited to have you join us today. The session is going to be from 12 to 1. My name is Sharon Grattan, and I'll be your host today. I am the Program Coordinator and Northern Regional Coordinator with AutismBC. I reside on the unceded territory and lands of the Tsimshian and Somaliac-speaking peoples. I identify as neurodivergent, and I am a parent of autistic children. If everyone has the opportunity, if you could put the city and location that you're in, and also the Indigenous territory and lands that you're on. Today, our presenter is David Chen, certified financial planner and lead planner at DC Complete Financial. David is a parent of autistic children and a manager of that firm. He is an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities and has knowledge of navigating financial questions and systems with autistic adults and caregivers of autistic children. Today, David will answer questions and offer valuable advice on managing finances as an autistic individual or someone supporting a person with disabilities. AutismBC tries not to promote one firm or bank over another. We know that everyone's personal relationships with people at different banks vary. As part of our talks, we bring people to speak who have proven knowledge and understanding of autistic allyship to talk to our members. Also from DC Financial team, we have Cody Ribest, who is an associate advisor who has specific area expertise and will be answering some of the questions. I'd also like to welcome Sarah Taylor, our Vancouver Island coordinator, who will be managing the chat box and Zoom tech-related stuff. Participants can remain muted until we reach the Q&A section after the main Q&A talk to keep the session running smoothly. Instead of raising your hand before the Q&A, please type your questions into the chat box. To front load the session today, you're welcome to ask questions in the chat area. Just know that we cannot provide one-on-one financial advice in the session specific to your individual need. Following the talk today, we will provide an email follow-up that will be sent to all registered attendees. And also, additionally, once the talk is completed, there will be a survey that will pop up on the screen if you can take the time to complete that. That helps go into us building out future talks that are relevant to our members. So thank you for joining us today. Let's give a warm welcome to David and Cody. Hi, David.
Thank you. Hi. I think what I'll do is start off with a quick disclaimer, obviously, because we're dealing with a lot of financial and legal matters. So everything we're talking about today is current as of sort of today, but things do change quite rapidly. And I need to stress this, that the concepts that we talk about on average will affect a typical person or family, but you really need to talk to a financial planner about the specifics, because all it takes is one small difference in your individual needs and the whole plan changes. And if you follow a sort of typical blueprint, you will find out usually 10, 20, 30 years down the road, it was completely wrong and there's no way to undo the damage. So I need to stress that this is strictly informational. I know a lot of information is available online. And especially nowadays, we see this a lot. You know, I have close ties with a lot of physicians, and they say this too. It's very tempting to become the doctor, but don't be the doctor. The best is to know what your situation is and go see the truly, you know, licensed professional to get the proper diagnosis and treatment plan for what you need to have happen. Very quickly myself, I've been dealing with disability finances since 2006. I'm married into that. My brother-in-law has Asperger's, And I realized how complex this is because it's not just about the province, it's about the feds, and it's also about family politics. So when you deal with all three, it gets really dicey. The key part that's really difficult is, as much as we would love that the government is there to take care of us, they look at this as a poverty model. They do not want to give support if they believe you'll have it. And that's why when we answer a lot of these questions, you're going to see this recurring theme that you are constantly going to be tested as to whether or not it's applicable for you. And there's constant clawbacks and things that they do just to make sure that the right people are actually getting the benefits. So like all things, it really is a couple of bad apples that have really spoiled this for the whole bunch. But this is part of why we do this, to educate you so you know what's going on, but more importantly, to get you to advocate. The government's only change when you understand how difficult this is for your children or yourselves, and you go and say, we need some change. So that's a bit about myself. I do actually have three children that have a permanent disability, two with autism, one with a permanent hearing loss. All have designations at school. So I get that. I've been a PAC chair advocating for those things at school. We have a lot of funding problems there. Some of you may know my son, Max. He was the young child that 2 years ago had an empty birthday party where out of a bunch of things that we didn't expect to happen, one out of 19 of his classmates showed up. And that went worldwide. It wasn't meant to get at the parents for not coming or not responding. It was more to learn from what happened from that and to build systems that would prevent your children from going through the same thing. So that's me in the background. Why don't we dive straight into the questions? What we did is we got a bunch that were sent to AutismBC. And because we do have limited time and there's sort of a limited scope as to how we can answer this, we sort of top loaded and selected the most relevant to most of you, but also that the answers are complex. And if you make a mistake there, it can have serious ramifications. So that's why those are the questions we're going to deal with mostly today. If we have time, we'll take those that are posted in the chat. But really the best thing to do if you don't get the answer you're looking for, contact a financial planner that has expertise in this area.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, thank
Sharon,
you,
you
Dave.
got the, oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump right into the first question is, do you have any tips for planning and sticking to a budget? Michael, a community member, is interested in advice on budgeting. He wants to manage his money so he can do things like take part in his community.
Great question. Personally, I like to just pay cash whenever I can. If it's not in the bank account, I'm not going to overspend. But really, Cody is our expert with dealing with that. So I'll pass the mic to him and he can answer that.
Yeah, so thanks, David. I'll just briefly introduce myself as well. So I've worked with David for coming up on a couple of years now. My specialty is working specifically with veterans and active serving members of the military, and especially veterans with disability, and helping them take advantage of the unique kind of benefits that we have available to us, myself being an Army veteran as well. But additionally, previously, I worked with the banks for about 3 years, most recently at Bank of Montreal. While I was there, I did a lot of debt and credit related work, debt consolidations, personal financing and budgeting and that kind of thing. So yes, I definitely can touch on this question here. So from the bank's perspective, personal budgeting is basically looking at what we call a cash flow statement. We're going to look at your money coming in and all your money going out. What we're going to do from there is see what's non-discretionary, the stuff you need, food, perhaps a car to get around to work, and distinguish that from our discretionary expenses like going out to eat, maybe ordering Uber Eats or something like that. The tricky thing with Vancouver area in general and BC in general is that it's very, very different in terms of what we recommend spending on each of these, sections of your personal life versus the rest of Canada. When I was working in the prairies for the bank, we recommended no more than 36% of your income should go towards housing. That is actually impossible in BC. So I've seen, people doing mortgage applications spending as much as 65, 70% on housing, and that's not very uncommon. That leaves very little for the rest of your financial expenses. It is unique to each person what is discretionary and what is not discretionary, right? But the very basics of it, if you have debt, coming into a budgeting session or a debt counseling session and you've already got debt, very basically, we're going to recommend take any savings, leave yourself with about 3 to 6 months on average of emergency expenses. That's cash you should never, ever spend. It should be held in a savings account. It is for the case in which you may lose your job or an emergency happens. You need to make sure that you're not going to get yourself into either more debt, higher interest rate debt, like that's very relevant now. If you need to now go and pull on lines of credit, it costs you about 5 times as much as it did a few years ago. And so, yeah, we want to have that buffer. But any other savings, that's going to go towards the highest interest rate debt first. And so that's typically credit cards. A lot of you may or may not realize credit cards are, 20 to now 26, 27% interest, which is a lot. It's a lot more than you're going to earn in your investment accounts, RDSP, RSPs. So that should be the priority. And then from there, going on to, other non-tax deductible debt. So that's stuff that, personal expenses, car loans, that kind of thing. It's really about eliminating that debt first before we get into any serious budgeting. To be able to, invest and put money away, you need to have savings, you need to have cash flow. And that starts with paying down that debt first. I hope that touched on most of it, but I'll just elaborate a little bit more. Once we find that cash flow for you guys, the first thing we're going to recommend is, again, start putting that into accounts like perhaps a TFSA, tax-free savings accounts, because this is money that's available to you anytime. It can be used for, anything from interest-bearing investments like GICs and even just a savings account within, all the way to stocks and bonds and mutual funds and that kind of stuff. So it is very client specific, but the very first thing you should always be doing is paying off that high interest debt, especially credit cards. And that is not to say that credit cards should be avoided. It's just to say that you really don't want to carry a balance on them month to month.
That's great. Thank you. You mentioned 3 to 6 months emergency expense funding. So is that the total you make in 1 month that you would be putting aside? So up to like 6 months of salary, or is that a percentage of that?
So that's a great question. So to clarify, when I say 3 to 6 months of emergency expenses, it's actually on the other side of expenses. So if I spend, $2,000 to $4,000, let's say $2,000 a month on my non-discretionary expenses, housing, food, everything else that I need to continue to live, then that would mean I would need at least $6,000, but potentially upwards of $12,000 of savings in order to be a buffer. Because that way, if I don't have any income coming in, I know it buys me time, right? And that means I don't have to take credit card debt. I don't have to take interest debt or high interest debt or remortgage or something like that, or even pull out investments that's, doing a lot more productive stuff, right? So that's specifically what we mean when we say have that emergency savings as a buffer. And it's generally 3 to 6 months. Also depends on, if you're a contract worker or maybe a lower security job, you're going to want to have more, right? Because there's not that income, that guaranteed income coming in. So yeah, thanks, Sharon.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to question number 2. This was from an anonymous community member. They asked, my autistic adult son with the DTC, which is the disability tax credit, relies on limited income from persons with disabilities, so PWD, and part-time work around $700 per month. From his total monthly income, about $1,500, he buys groceries, pays bills, saves for his TFSA, RDSP, and RRSP. All his funds are kept in a bank. Is there a better way to prepare for his future financially?
Okay, so before I answered that, I think there might be a little bit of misunderstanding as to what is deemed to be essential sort of reserves for the variety of people you have on here. So if you're talking about parents who are neurotypical, have no disability, it's pretty much, your housing costs, your utilities, food, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to someone that is on PWD, it will be similar, but you have to also stress on certain components like having a mobile phone. That mobile phone with internet is critical to be filing your PWD report. If you don't file the report, they could interrupt your payment. That could be disastrous if that's not in place. So, if you had to pick between internet at home, but you don't have a full-on computer and you're just running, entertainment with the TV, that's not considered minimum expenses. But that mobile phone with the internet to do all the things you need for banking, filing your PWD reports, and also finding a job, if that's what you want, that is critical, right? So again, just illustrates that you got to talk to a specialist because how you budget for that 3 to 6 months is very, very specific to the person, right? So the question that is being asked is actually a very common one because especially right now, we're trying to encourage our kids to become more independent, right? So the good thing is that if you've been in this field long enough, you'll know that the excluded income or the income limit where they would now disqualify you from PWD used to be really low. So it was even more of a poverty model. So now that it's higher, we're getting more cash flowing in. The challenge is that if you understand how PWD works and also how some estate laws work, you can't do the traditional sort of investment. So as an example, the TFSA, RSP, and non-registered funds will be used to add up to your 100,000 sort of asset limit. If you cross over that, then your PWD gets interrupted. And the way they like to do it is you cannot drop below that limit by giving the money away. You have to spend it. You have to show that you've consumed it because they don't want sort of, in essence, like a money laundering thing happening, right? You're over limit, you pass it to someone to drop below, they think you don't have it, and you go back on. It's complex. So when a typical person without DTC is trying to save, absolutely. TFSA makes sense, totally. RSP, if your income's high enough, absolutely it makes sense. But the problem is if you're on PWD, the only exempt asset is the RDSP or a trust. And that trust must be a very specific, what we call qualified disability trust. The taxation around that has changed now. When I started in 2006, pretty much any testamentary discretionary trust now qualified, but now it's very, very specific. I know some of you have not heard that technical name. The more common name is a Henson Trust. So that cannot be structured on your own because it's a complex piece of legal work. And two other problems come in when we're talking about something like this. This is why this question it's difficult to answer because it's a role play without enough information. So when I say that, if you have a trust as another vehicle, you cannot have blended sources of money coming in. Like the typical way we do this in estate planning is we'll set up a trust for the individual with disabilities at time of death of the last parent. You get a certain tax advantage by doing that. However, if someone goes, oh, my relative who's got a disability has this trust and I want to add money to it so that they can have a little bit more, but they add to it when they're alive, it now disqualifies the whole trust because there's a legal change to the registration that most people aren't aware occurs. So again, this is why I'm saying you can't ask this question and assume you can do this on your own. Really, you've indicated that you have a child with PWD earning some income. You've asked the question how better to do this. It can't be answered without actually seeing someone. Another complication, which again, in my years of doing this, I tend to like to take difficult problems. You know, we have a lot of people that have a passion for this field, but I love complicated problems because it takes a lot of legwork for us to figure out what the answer is. And one that has popped up, which I'm willing to bet might affect at least one of the people on this Zoom meeting, is a dual citizenship. We came across a child with, actually, it was Down syndrome, and she had an American parent and a Canadian parent. By law, the child is American by birth, even though the child was born here. And that's just something the Americans do. Now, problem is that the child cannot get rid of that citizenship or renounce it until 18 and must have mental capacity. So literally, there's no way for the child to say, I don't want to have anything to do with the States. Now, where the complication comes in is with the RDSP. So the Americans, because if you have a split citizenship, you actually have to file tax returns and tax filings with the US, right? So in this situation, there's something called an F-bar that needs to be filed, as well as the Americans will look at what you've disclosed in the F-bar to figure out if that account has the same tax treatment status in the States. If it does not exist in the States, they will tax you on it. The RDSP does not exist in the States. So when the Americans see that show up on their desk with an F-bar, they go, not only is this not tax deferred, the grants and bonds are considered to be earnings. So in that year when you get it, you owe taxes. And if you don't file that, the F-bar, when it first started, the penalty was $10,000 fine for each page not filed per year. And then if they figured out you owe taxes, just like Canada, now you have daily compound interest penalties against what you owed from all the way back there. And this is part of the complication. This is why I'm literally saying we cannot tell you how to do this without knowing that background information. I hope that makes sense. Now, another thing that is often overlooked, and I'll get Cody to answer this, is insurance, because we also have control issues that show up. Cody?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'll touch a bit on this. So most people, when we think of life insurance, it's basically for that tax-free benefit money. However, probably the number one thing we actually use life insurance for, especially in cases where families have a disabled child, is the control aspect. And what that really means is basically keeping the money out of PGT's hands at the end of the day, because they have a interest in putting as much money in the provincial coffers as possible at the end of the day, unfortunately. So an example of this would be, let's say we placed a parent as the life insured on an insurance policy. An RDSP is set up for the beneficiary of the RDSP. We would rather have the insurance proceeds, so the benefit money when the parent passes away, go directly into the RDSP rather than into the hands of the estate or the beneficiary, for example, because this allows the RDSP to lose one of its biggest restrictions, which is how long you have to wait after grant and bond money is paid into it in order to actually pull it out and use it. And this is upwards of 10 years. And so that is very restrictive on people who might need to actually live off this RDSP. Instead, if we take $200,000 tax-free from an insurance policy as an example, put it directly into the RDSP, now all of a sudden there's no restrictions at all. That is a tax-exempt asset. It can be used immediately, it can be used for anything, however the beneficiary wants. And that's really what we mean about that control and just putting money where it's most efficiently used. It's a huge, huge difference at the end of the day. And quite honestly, at banks, there's a reason they don't touch RDSPs in general. There's only a couple that do because it's a huge liability for them, and it's so complicated, and situations are client specific that it can literally ruin somebody's life if you don't set it up correctly, and especially involving life insurance as an example.
That's really great. I didn't know that myself, that there was anything tied in with insurance and RDSP. So that's really helpful information. And someone from the chat also mentioned that David explaining the American dual citizenship situation was really helpful for them as well. I'm going to move on to the next question. And it's sort of tying in with the PWD. So someone who is receiving PWD benefits. And the question around what happens with the benefits if you earn over 16,200 annually, and if we can look at explaining the clawback reduction and whether there's a point to earning less money and if that's beneficial.
Great question. Happens to most people when they get to 18, especially now because we're getting a lot more supports in schools. So our children are coming out more capable to enter the workforce. The clawback is literally a dollar for dollar clawback. So when you make 16,200 a year, the minute you make $1 more, they take off $1 from PWD. You make $10, they take off 10 from PWD. So in essence, they've created a massive hump that you can't get past. Like it literally makes no sense to work an extra hour to make $20 to get $20 less because the two will not add up, right? So until you get to the combination of, it's roughly about 32,000 once we add it all up. Once you get to that as a total income, you're not going to make more. So this is why I said it's kind of it's not a very forward-thinking type of poverty inclusion model. To be able to earn some to make more, but then you hit this wall at 16.2 and there's no benefit until you cross over 32,000, right? So yeah, it's depressing to think of it that way, but that is a reality. So a lot of times it is important to think that if you're going to be making money, if you want to make more, maybe prep yourself for a job that makes a ton more. So that when you go into full-time work and you really cross over that threshold. Otherwise, I'll be honest, if it was me and the government said, oh, well, you made $100 more and we're going to take $100 from you, really, there's no incentive to do this. That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's something that's come up with our April acceptance campaign. We've had adults talking about, feeling like they have to work full time because it's the only option. And then you deal with situations where you're ending up in burnout and trying to manage full-time work and then also struggling through with your burnout. So yeah, I think it's a really big challenge. The other question that was related to that, so if you earn that 16,200, is it worthwhile to file your taxes?
You have to actually. So I have clients where they go, well, I don't make that, so why do I care? There's a minimum threshold of around 12,000. If you make that, you don't get taxed. So they're kind of like, why do I care? The problem is that after a few years, the government goes, we're not going to pay you anything until we get the tax return. And that's why, if some of you remember, this was probably about 6 years ago, the government in power created sort of this mandatory status that you had to file a tax return. And then they opened up some offices to try and help with that. But, it's hit and miss. But the end of the line, it's an absolute truth. You have to file it no matter what, even if you're zero income. because there are benefits that are associated to what is your tax status. And without that, they put it on hold and they don't care. And if you have delinquent tax returns, you get into kind of a world of hurt because number one, they have a huge backlog for delinquent. We've worked with clients with that and we've seen stuff take 6 months, a year just for them to look at and go, yeah, we agree with this. Oh, okay, you're entitled to that. So we'll activate this again. So that can hurt a lot. If you find out you actually owe tax money, the problem is that they can hit you with daily compound interest, which can grow very rapidly. The other problem is they now kind of due to serve, the government is really short on cash, to be very blunt. They have done a lot of things in our tax continuing education workshops that we have to take to maintain our license. And everything looks like they're literally hunting for money. They are looking at people, and if they think you're bad, they're going to red flag you, and then they're going to take away, credits and deductions and use a method they called alternative minimum tax and essentially cause your tax file to go up in how much you owe. So when that happens, if you've done this 2 years in a row, they also red flag you for higher penalties, right? So it compounds everything. So literally, it's kind of like living with a sword hanging over your head, going, well, I don't really think it's important, but I don't know if the sword's going to drop on me, right? So I do always recommend that you do file it. There's a bunch of free options through a lot of societies, so you don't have to worry about like, I don't get it. And there is always help out there. And if at the very least you file it through free software, like, QuickTax has a very basic, free version, you'll get an assessment and the government may or may not agree with it, but at least you filed it. Without filing it, they're not going to do anything. And they just keep holding this, red flag over your head. So end of the day, please file it.
That's really helpful. And yeah, that sounds scary to be in that situation where you've been flagged and trying to claw yourself out of that. That sounds like it would be a really challenging situation. Um, and I think related to like filing taxes and finding people out there to support you in navigating this. And the other question that came in around this topic was um, there is community hesitance around finding financial planners or institutions that they can trust based on past experiences and um, looking at how to build trust and sort of guide someone to build that trust and looking at this planning aspect of not only like their taxes but also into the retirement planning. So um, I guess the question is more around how do you find a trusting financial institution or advisor? What should you be looking for when you're seeking one?
Great question. It actually affects everybody, whether you have disabilities or not. I would say the number one thing is if the advisory team is not interested in all of the details around you, they can't plan for you. That is a red flag in itself. I can't like say how often I run into this, and it's sort of a dark side of our industry. But in 2018, when I was in the election, I had a supporter say something, and what he said still rings today because it's so applicable. He said, it's like there are people out there with a solution hunting for a problem to fix. And if you get the feeling like someone's trying to sell me something or do something to make money, but it doesn't sound like it fits me or they didn't ask enough, like this dual citizenship is a perfect example. If someone doesn't ask where the parent's from, how are you filing your taxes, they will never figure out that the child might have a dual citizenship. Well, if they go ahead and do an RDSP, which would be the next logical step, we got a huge problem. All right. So that's where a lot of the trust is built. You will pretty much figure out within the first 10 minutes to half an hour how much the advisor is trying to figure out who you are, why you have obstacles, what your plans are, and your challenges are going into the future. And if they're not focusing on knowing you inside and out for that, that's already a huge red flag. After that, what I would say, the next thing that is quite common, and it's kind of like why we are an independent boutique house, you don't want to go to an institution that really only has their product suite. There are complex situations, and having someone that can access a variety of financial instruments out there increases the likelihood that you got a good fit. The best way I could talk about this is kind of like it's like shoes, right? We have kids, they have neurodiversity, and I'll be frank, I haven't figured out the rhyme or reason why any of those kids like the shoes they have. But they are like stuck. That shoe can be hole ridden, whatever, and they're like, nope, I don't want anything else. And you can't find anything to replace it. Well, that's the fit, right? If you go, well, I only have these Adidas's, but your child doesn't like them, well, you're not going to get a fit. So you want to be able to have advisory teams that can go out there and get the right product fit for your problems. And there can be very complex questions that need other team members to come in. So we don't actually operate in a silo. We work with, creditors to put together complex things for people that have disabilities and they're adults, because to the banks, they're not great credit files for them to deal with. We were just dealing with one right now, including myself and our connection at BMO. We have to deal with lawyers. And, when it comes to disability and disability trust and estate planning, it is very different, because we have to worry about like, where's the trust? Who's going to be the trustee? What if you move? Right. So someone who knows how to put together trust, but does not factor those things in, you're going to get a faulty plan. Right. So that's sort of the next moving piece. And the last one, frankly, I would look at, sort of costing. I recently had a client who referred to me by another organization that we do work with as a preferred vendor. And he said, well, I need help with my tax returns. 2 years ago, my regular tax person retired. I went to somebody new. They didn't figure out how to use a DTC. I've got 2 tax filings without the DTC. I need to fix this. And because we're a paid service, we're not a charity, I said, well, you could ask CRA to do a backfile, because they're doing that now for free. Because in the old days, not so great people in our industry were taking advantage of people by doing the DTC application and taking 25% of the 10-year backfile, which oftentimes was in excess of like $2,500 for something that took like 10 hours to do tops, right? When we did it, it was like a $500 thing. And we were shocked to find out people were taking 2,500 bucks from people. So when you see that kind of discrepancy, then you kind of go, well, why? Right? If a service is free, why didn't you recommend that first? And if we have complications, yeah, we'll go into the paid service. So really choose your people based on what you see as obvious flags. And frankly, and I know it's so tempting to meet people on Zoom and all that, you really have to meet people in person. I don't know about you guys, but I find that if I'm in front of the wrong person, I do get the heebie-jeebies and I go, that's not who I want to be with.
David, I'll just jump in and add a couple more things. Speaking from experience at the bank, specifically in regards to trust in the financial institutions, especially the big banks, they do themselves no favors. And, one of the biggest reasons why I left the bank was just because of obvious unethical, practices that go on there. And I totally understand where people are coming from, and that's what drove me to be independent. But the very basic reason for a lot of the horror stories you hear at the bank, and probably your guys' experiences, your negative experiences there, is very simply bank advisors are salespeople. They work for the bank. They sell, just like David alluded to, they sell their product and their product only. Even if they wanted to recommend something else, or if they know there's something else better, they are not allowed to recommend that. They are order takers. They're transactional only. You go in there, you say, I have 10,000 bucks. They'll say, basically, here's 100 different products I can put you in. And it's all, for example, BMO stuff, right? And to add to that, and perhaps besides just avoiding the banks altogether, which is frankly impossible in a lot of people's situations, I would say an easy way to determine whether you're getting honest, unbiased advice, which is extremely rare in this industry, is to look at how is my advisor incentivized? How is he getting paid? Bringing it back to the bank, they get paid based on gross volume of sales, not performance of the investments, not hours spent. It's just how much money went into that account, and they're incentivized to constantly grow these accounts, regardless of that's what you should be doing. That's why you see, people with massive mortgages, high rate loans, and everything, but they've got hundreds of thousands of dollars in their investment account because their incentive is to just keep pouring money in there. So I think it's extremely important, and especially from an independent perspective, to look for advisors who have credentials across the industry, multi-licensed, like we are on the insurance and the investment side of things. I think this was touched on before, but if you go to an insurance guy who's only got the insurance license and you say, I've got 500 extra bucks a month to put away, he's going to tell you to get an insurance policy and fund the insurance policy with your excess cash flow. Whereas if you go to an investment guy only, he's going to say, well, put it in your account. They're not looking at the full picture because that's not how they get paid. So I think it's very important, and advisors must disclose this to you guys. If you ask them, how do you get paid? How are you reimbursed for your services? They must disclose that, and they should be without you even asking. So that is a huge, easy indicator as to, are you getting unbiased and honest advice? So that's what I'll throw in. I hope that makes sense to everyone.
I think that was really helpful in just understanding the overall structure of the different and varying organizations and their fee structure and how they get paid. And there are some questions now in the chat I think we can transition to. Sarah, if we could stop recording.